Thank you, Dr. Bonnen. And, Dr. Bonnen, thank you for all your work. I mean, a lot of these questions are coming from, there's not very many of us that spend the hours looking at this budget that you do, and there's some procedural questions about how things ended up, and that's kind of where I'm going with this line of questioning. So what day did you close the budget?
So when you start at the end, and we said, okay, at the latest, we want to have the conference committee report on the budget on the floor on Saturday, this last Saturday of the regular session, and you begin to work backwards through the process that the LBB has to go through with respect to printing and complying with all of our rules for layout. We were asked, and in fact did, close our decisions on the budget not this past Wednesday, but Wednesday the prior week at about 1:30 in the morning.
Okay, so you were asked to close the budget. So the budget isn't closed by a vote of this body.
Well, ultimately, the body does have the decision as to whether to pass this conference committee report or not.
And that's Dr. Bonnen, that's a different question for me. I just mean to the point we got where the budget was closed, where nothing else was coming in or out. Was it closed by a vote of your committee? Is it closed by the chair? I'm just trying to verify the process.
Let me take a step further back. So on Monday, and I apologize, I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I can't tell you the day of the month that it was, the date. But on the prior Monday, the conference committee, House and Senate conferees met in a public meeting, and we adopted the conferees' decisions on Articles 1 through 8. And then we had about 48 hours remaining where other adjustments were made in Article 9, which is where our contingency language exists. And to speak to a point that you may be trying to raise, which was more acute this session than in previous sessions, at that point in time, we had, and this is a rough estimate, probably close to $30 billion in other pieces of legislation that were still in flux. And so we didn't know what property tax legislation would finally look like. We were not even aware at that time of the investment we would be making in dispatchable thermal generation. And so just in those two strategies combined, that's $22.5 billion. And I can go on, but the point...
Can I ask you a different way? Would it be fair to say once you get to that process, it's you and your counterpart in the Senate that are doing the working backwards?
So what we're trying to do is take a look at every piece of legislation that is still alive in the process, how much it might cost, and make our final budget decisions to allow for plans to cover the cost of those bills that have yet to reach their final work product or their final shape and be approved or disapproved by the body.
Well, that leads me to my next question. As you closed the budget, or as the budget was closed, through the process you just explained, we ended up with about $3.9 billion in the budget for formula funding and teacher pay. Is that correct?
So the rider that you're referring to is a contingency rider in Article 9. And what we chose to do was, rather than having, say, 5 different contingent articles pertaining to public education, or contingent riders, we created one rider. And I have it in front of me, and I can, in fact, I would like to briefly go over it.
I've got a copy of it right here.
So, well, for the body, I'd like them to know what's in that rider. So there's $500 million for curriculum, $300 million for school safety, and that is separate from the $1.1 billion for school safety that is in the supplemental, which is separate from HB1. There's $4 billion for FSP formula funding increases and teacher compensation. There's $500 million contingent for school choice. There's $49.4 million for virtual education. Additionally, more for informational purposes, there's $588.5 million for TRS Active Care. That's premium support for our active teachers. There's $2.366 billion, which is an increase due to the increased golden penny yield, $60 million increase for new instructional facilities allotment, and $307 million for instructional materials. So all combined, those are $8.668 billion. When you add in the $1.1 billion for school safety, plus another $3.2 billion fully funding projected enrollment growth, that's a total of $12.9 billion. Now,
well, it would be if we had passed a bill that authorized the formula funding, the teacher compensation, school choice, and virtual education. So we didn't quite get there. So my question is this: when House Bill 100 left this House, it was worth $5.4 billion as engrossed, and you voted for it. I voted for it. Nearly we all voted for it. House Bill 11 left with $645 million in it as engrossed. We all voted for it. It was almost unanimously adopted or passed out to the Senate again. Now, instead of having roughly a little over $6 billion for teacher pay and formula funding, we have 3.9 for both of those things, and it appears to me that those subjects are contingent on a bill to pass that we didn't pass a bill. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's correct. That these are contingent, or at least the items that you mentioned, are contingent upon statutory legislation. So the budget doesn't appropriate the dollars for these strategies per se. They're waiting on passage of legislation, and they're not linked to one another. In other words, there could be curriculum legislation that passes and school safety does not pass. That wouldn't mean that neither is funded. You could fund one and not the other. It just depends on what actually finally
So from a statutory
passes.
standpoint, or from a budget standpoint, you're saying they're not linked. So I'm understanding you correctly. You're saying that we can pass a teacher pay bill in some special session or sometime before the budget opens again next session, and we can pay our teachers without creating an ESA?
That is technically a possibility. You'd have to get the votes to do that, but the budget does not require.
Right. Well, I heard
that
I heard Senator Creighton say from the microphone yesterday that there would be no teacher pay bill without an ESA, but you're telling the body that is a policy decision between the two chambers, that is not a provision of the budget that has to happen.
Yeah.
One is not linked to the other.
Yeah, so House Bill 1 does not link those two together, except that they are listed in this rider. And one of the reasons we structured the rider this way is from experience. So we had a large public education finance bill that passed at the end of last session. It was very comprehensive. And it became awkward in the interim for the TEA to make adjustments among the strategies in some of that legislation based on the rider that was in the budget. Mm-hmm. So this would, with LBB approval, allow for the TEA to make some adjustments within these categories, mm-hmm. contingent upon what passes and what we approve. So they wouldn't have more money, but you could conceivably make adjustments between the categories that are outlined.
Thank you for that answer. I want to go back to just a minute to the reduction of what the body voted for and the 3.9 that's in there now. As you were working backwards and having to make the hard decision of what's going to be in the final budget you're presenting here, at that particular time, House Bill 11 and House Bill 100 were not dead bills. They were still very much alive. What was the policy decision to reduce the two from $6 billion to 3.9?
That's a great question, and that really came down to a couple of things. One, we're sensitive to staying within all of our spending limits, and we wanted to make sure that we did that, which of course we've done. The second thing is that we have contingent in this budget $5 billion for dispatchable thermal generation. There's $1.5 billion for broadband. There's $3 billion for a new higher education endowment. And as we started to add up the total amount, we had to make adjustments so that we fit within our overall budget.
Okay. The last thing I want to touch on this subject, going back to the to the line items that on here that did not pass this particular time, which is formula funding, teacher compensation, school choice, and virtual education. And you said the budget doesn't require us to pass a bill that ties any two together. So that $500 million, that's a line item in the budget for school choice, hypothetically, if the body passed a vote to pay teachers and not do an ESA, is that $500 million fungible?
It could technically be moved with approval between the strategies.
Thank you very much for clearing that up for me, Dr. Bonnen. I'm almost done. Do you remember April 6th, I'm sure? It was probably your favorite day of the session. And there was an amendment. It was Amendment 45, otherwise known as the Herrera Amendment, that was adopted in HB1. That amendment was adopted 86 to 52 with 11 P and Bs. Was that amendment direction from this body that we were not going to spend state dollars on vouchers or ESAs, as we call them today? Is that the way you understood the amendment?
That amendment is not in HB1 now.
That leads me to my next question. So the body put the amendment on, and I know things change, and particularly you've explained the process of how you got to what you're presenting for a vote today. What was the process to strip an amendment? Did the Appropriates Committee take that vote? I know the body didn't take the vote. In fact, we've had about 3 votes on this subject, is why we don't have a bill today, as you're well aware. I was just wondering, is that something that's just a policy decision made when you're working backwards on what stays in and what doesn't?
No, that is a difference between the House and Senate versions. And of course, you can only have one budget in the final analysis. So you've got to, that's part of the conference, just as any other piece of legislation where you're negotiating the differences between 2 bills.
Okay. So, and finally, Dr. Bonnen, and you did a great job at the very beginning explaining this, but I want to get it very clear on the record, because I am voting for the budget you're presenting us. And once again, I thank you for your work. By taking the vote for this budget, are we voting for a voucher or an ESA?
No, that will have to be done in separate legislation.
And that $500 million that's in the budget right now that is set aside for an ESA could be fungible at some point. It doesn't have to go to an ESA.
It doesn't have to go anywhere. It could sit there and lapse. It could potentially be used for other purposes, but it can't be used for an ESA without ESA legislation passing.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers, and I will be voting for your budget, Dr. Bonnen. Thank you for your work. I appreciate you.